great to be presenting to all of you today, and thanks very much for the opportunity to do this. We're really excited about getting this research out there. It's been a couple of years in the making, this piece of work, so we're really, really excited to now be able to bring it to unions, delegates, and people working in this space right across the country. I'm going to start off with a little story. And my story is about a friend of mine who I spoke to as part of this project when we were doing elicitation interviews with union members of colour. And she was, at the time she was a delegate, she was a young woman of colour organising for the first time in her workplace, and she went along to her first union rally in Australia. And her comrades there were chanting Australian jobs for Australians. Now, she knew that her comrades didn't really mean anything by that. They weren't trying to offend her particularly, but she thought, if that's what we're about, then where do I fit in this movement? And many of you will have had pretty similar experiences, whether you're on the back of a truck speaking into a megaphone or you're reading a press release, there are times when our language doesn't quite nail the values that we bring to our movement and the values of international solidarity that we hold so dear. So this friend of mine, was really concerned, yes, what does it mean for me in my role in the union movement, but also what about all the unionists of colour that I'm organising too? So we need, comrades, the success of the labour movement depends on the unity of the working class, and capital and conservative politicians are always going to come in and try to divide us along racial, gender, religious lines, what have you, but by the type of work we're doing, whether it's casual or permanent or whether we're young or old, they will always try to divide us along various lines. And we're seeing this happen more and more, particularly in the political sphere. And we're seeing, have seen for a couple of decades now, groups like Pauline Hanson and One Nation, the United Australia Party, coming in with a populist rhetoric that appeals to the working class, that positions all the ills of capitalism as the fault of our migrant brothers and sisters. And so unions really need, and the labour movement really needs, a narrative of working class solidarity that is more compelling than that divisive rhetoric. So this is my scary slide. I'm not sure how much this was publicised in the rest of the country, but of course it was very, very big news in Victoria while we were locked down, that there were riots outside the CFMU Vic office here. Do you guys remember seeing that? It was anti-vaxxers, and some of them were CFMU members, some of them were definitely not. And there were white supremacist flags and symbols being carried through that crowd, and have been pervasive throughout the sort of anti-vax movement here. And it was really startling to see for a lot of union officials. This project, that problem didn't come from nowhere, is the first scary thing that I'm going to say. We need to admit that some of the language that we have been using and some of the things that we talk about unintentionally stoke racial fears. So white supremacy, when I'm talking about white supremacy here, I'm not talking about one or two bad apples in our movement. I'm not talking about a skinhead with a Nazi tattoo. White supremacy is an entire system that our country has been built on since colonisation, and that we, soak up like a sponge every day of our lives. So it's really this work is challenging because we do need to look at our own internalised white supremacy. And it's really challenging, but I thank you for coming with me on this journey today. Okay, so the Race Class Narrative Project. In very simple terms, that there was some research done in the United States a couple of years ago that showed that when class-based appeals made explicit reference to race, that those appeals performed better across the electorate and across various different focus groups. So when you say working people need a living wage, that appeal was less successful than an appeal that says working people, whether we're black, brown, or white, we all need a living wage. That appeal outperformed the colourblind version, which was really interesting. And progressives in the United States really, did a ton of work around this, and really used the race class narrative to effect in a couple of important seats in the 2020 elections. And actually, Anoche Rosario has a podcast called Words to Win By, and one of her season two, episode 1, discusses how the race class narrative was used in Minnesota. But basically, we looked at this research and we found it interesting a couple of years ago. But we said, look, there is the potential for cultural difference between America and Australia. We know that Australia is less comfortable with words like black and brown. So let's test it out here. And that's where we got to. We started with a language analysis of, we looked at 100 coded pieces of information from right across the union movement. So when I say coded pieces, so it was examples of language from unions referencing race or referencing migration. And we looked at all those examples, over 100 examples, all different unions everywhere across Australia. And we coded them by the types of visual metaphor they were using and the various types of language they were using. And then we did a little bit of research and message testing with our friends at the ACTU, and now we're in the field application stage, so we get to bring this research to all of you. So let's start with the good news. The bits of language that we're already using that are great. There are already unions using assumed inclusion language. And this example here, I won't read out these examples. You can read them if you're interested. And, I'm sure these slides will be available to you after the presentation. Assumed inclusion is where you reference a union member of colour, and of course they are part of the union. We also see worker or person first language, so referring to a person's occupation, while also referencing that they are a Chinese or Burmese national in that example. We see from the teachers and nurses a lot, but also very notably MIA, that anti-racism is a professional responsibility. So teachers talk about the need to address racism in schools, and the need for teachers have a responsibility to stamp that out. And for journalists, particularly, the MIA produced a really excellent guide on for their members on using language that combats racist rhetoric. And of course, we see language like every worker in Australia. This is the really great language that we're seeing right across the movement. I think it started with what was then the NUW, but instead of Australian workers, every worker in Australia, can you imagine the difference that makes if you are a migrant worker and you're starting to see that language? But we do also see, and this is the big problem that we see in the language right across the movement, is victim blaming. And that can take either a really active or quite a passive form. So in the active form, it's foreigners are stealing Aussie jobs. you see less and less of that these days. What we tend to see now is something along the lines of exploited foreign workers who are displacing Australian employees. So there's an expression of sympathy for the foreign worker, but still the foreign worker is cast as foreign and as essentially the problem in that situation. So it's the foreign worker whose labour is displacing the local worker. Whereas this is not an accurate representation of what we as unionists believe, right? It was some business manager's decision to cut costs and employ a migrant worker either here on a lower wage or to contract that work out overseas where they can get away with lower wages. So what we really want to see is countering of that scarcity narrative whereby migrants and locals are competing over the same small pool of jobs and there's not enough jobs for everyone, with an expression of solidarity across racial differences in demanding safe workplaces, fair wages for every worker in Australia, no matter where you're from. Now, this is the architecture of a race-class narrative. So, you know, we saw some great things we're doing, we saw some problems with the victim blaming, and then we looked at the architecture of a race-class narrative as it was designed in the US. Values, villain, vision is how you design a race-class narrative. When you talk about, so first, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the concept of narrative, but it's not something that fits on a core flute, just so you're aware. We're not going to have like a 3-word slogan at the end of this. It's just, except that you've got values, villain, vision. But it's more like the underlying paragraph that communicates your values that you just keep in your head and your heart so that when you're on the back of a truck, you can come up with your messages on the fly. So it's that kind of language. It's not a snappy slogan. It's probably about a paragraph long. So your value statement needs to be simple enough that a 7-year-old can explain it to another 7-year-old. And why I say that is because it's really important that you don't start talking about the Fair Work Act. Very important to explain this to union officials, and I've been trying for 15 years, but nobody believes me. You do want to explicitly refer to the people who make up your everyone. Now, you know, when you say everyone, that's meant to include everyone. So why would you break up that everyone? Well, the reality is that when we say everyone and when the right says everyone, they mean people of a certain colour, basically, and they mean people in a certain social strata. So when you break up that everyone and you say everyone, no matter what we look like or the colour of our skin, no matter what language we speak, no matter what God we pray to, that helps solidify the everyone for people. And it's, I think, really exciting. When I ran this project with the nurses in Victoria a couple of weeks ago, they came up with one for their aged care campaign that was like, whether it's ya or go or nana, everyone should have a right to secure aged care retirement. So that was gorgeous. You know, you want to find a creative way of explaining that cross-racial solidarity. And then in the villain section, we want to use active language, call out deliberate division, and avoid those big picture concepts like capitalism and racism in preference to like real outcomes for people, like wages being suppressed or the water we drink, those sorts of things. And then we get to our vision. We don't want to just say what we're against. We want to describe the beautiful future that we are creating. And I'm sorry, I know I'm running way behind on time here. This is a brand new ad that we've produced today, I think, using that race class narrative.
An economy that works is one that works for everyone. no matter what you do, where you come from, or what language you speak. Some politicians try to divide us, saying things like,
"This election is about you, no one else."
But Australians know that we do better when we work together. Whether we've been here for generations or we're newly arrived, we all need good jobs that support our families. We thrive when we have the opportunity to educate our kids, look after our health, shop locally, and live with safety and dignity. Together, we can raise living standards, not just lower living costs. We can vote for what's best for all of us together, not just the few. Authorised by El Hilakari, Victorian Trades Hall Council, Carlton.
The project and how it was put together. This was message testing we did with an online panel. So the aim of this research was to examine the use of language around race and also ethnicity, with the ultimate intent of us being able to build support for union narratives, which Edwina's just been talking to, and really encourage that cross-racial solidarity that we're trying to achieve. So the research was done with just over 1,000 people. We applied demographic quotas to make sure it was representative of the Australian general population, and we did those quotas on age, gender and region. We asked a battery of questions about values and attitudes to unions, voting intention, racial tolerance, where we used a racial tolerance index I'll take you through, and also around job security. And we did 2 sets of message testing within this research. So the first was the preference between class only and then race class constructions, and then also perceived accuracy of messages around employer blaming versus victim blaming constructions. So just to take you through a little bit of background on a couple of things that we've put together, just so you've got the context. So I mentioned that we were looking at trying to understand racial tolerance. So this research drew on previous research, such as the Minnesota Dial Survey, and also on moral foundations theory as a predictor of attitudes and how you might be able to shift those attitudes as well. So we asked them to consider 4 different statements and to give their level of agreement or disagreement on these 4 different statements around racial tolerance. And as you can see, 2 of those were negative statements and 2 of those were positive statements. Out of this, we conducted a racial tolerance index score, which was previous methodologies that have been established. And there was an opportunity for people to be either sort of up to a +8 if they were absolutely racially tolerant, and down to a -8 if they weren't. The other aspect we looked at was moral foundations theory, which I just mentioned around predictive attitudes and how to shift attitudes. So this explores the origins and the variation in human moral reasoning and why people determine whether something might be right or wrong for them. So it uses 2 batteries of statements and it scores for 5 separate foundations. And these are calculated for each respondent. So 2 of those foundations are care and fairness, and these are known to appeal more to progressive principles of morality. And then we have the other foundations of loyalty, authority and sanctity, which appeal to more conservative principles of morality. Okay, so I'm going to take you through some of these results now. We did quite a bit of analysis around this. So we were able to determine that 51% of Australians were found to be racially tolerant. So most of those were considered tolerant. So that's 37% of that 51, and 14% were considered tolerant. We had around 1 in 3, so 27% who were considered intolerant. Most of those were intolerant rather than being very intolerant, where we had 6%. So as you can see, when we're looking at the racial tolerance, it's really obvious that our union believers are the most racially tolerant, all the way through to our union rejectors who are the least racially tolerant. From this, we see very much that higher tolerance is linked to greater union support from these groups and also union membership, and it also actually increases with education. What we're also able to find is that tolerance is highest amongst women, so as you can see, considerably higher than men, and also much higher for those in the younger age groups, and it goes down basically as you get older. We also found tolerance was highest amongst temporary residents and those who mainly speak English at home as well, and migrants who have arrived to Australia in the last 5 to 10 years ago, which seems quite an obvious find that we would expect to find. As you can see on the top right-hand side, we have a scale of progressive through to conservative. And once again, this trend is really playing out that those that are most progressive are the most racially tolerant, all the way through to those that are the more highly conservative and are much less racially tolerant. The same also applies when we look at our different political parties. So most tolerant are those who consider themselves Greens voters, Labor voters and other independent voters. And as you can see, Pauline Hanson and United Australia Party come pretty far down the line. Looking now at the moral foundation scores, so these are the ones where I mentioned that care and fairness are more so linked to appeal to people who are more progressive. We have our loyalty, respect and sanctity that generally appeal more to people who have more conservative principles of morality. As you can see on the left-hand chart, we've charted here moral foundations versus tolerance. The green line is those that are very tolerant. So as you can see, they're scoring quite high, or the highest on the progressive aspects of moral foundations and much lower on the more conservative aspects. And when you look at sort of the reverse of that, of those that are very intolerant, which is the red line, you actually get to see the opposite of that as well. So once again, we're really seeing this data coming up again and again on itself and really showing that these results are very consistent. Okay, so to head into the really interesting stuff. So we did 2 lots of message testing. The first lot was around preference between class and race class. So we asked our respondents to choose between 4 statements that I have up on screen now. So statement 1A, just to give you a bit of context, it all started off with, to make life better for working people we need, and then 1A, better paying, secure jobs and quality education and healthcare for everyone. Statement 1B adds for everyone, but no matter where you're from or what language you speak. So it has the referencing nationality and language differences. And statement 1C is for everyone, no matter your skin colour. And then we had a control statement in there, which was our 1D statement, which was quite different from the others. As you can see, statement 1D was the preferred statement, which relates to nationality and language differences, very much to what Edwina was saying earlier on. And this was selected through an iterative process, 39% of decisions. Support for 1B, it increases with political progressiveness, as you might expect. It also increases for those that have languages other than English. It increases with recent immigration and tends to decrease with age, which is what we've seen in some of the previous data. Statement 1D, as you can see, had very low levels of support, so we actually excluded it from further analysis and just focused on the 3 priority statements. So a bit more about support for 1B. It's stronger amongst union believers, not domestic individualists, so those people that are more strongly aligned to the union movement, stronger amongst union members, Greens and Labor voters, significantly lower for Liberal National Party voters, so it's sitting at 34% versus 39%, much higher for females and males, those that are very progressive and also very tolerant and tolerant. So it's really shining through those results. We then looked at second message testing, and this was around accuracy of boss versus migrant blaming messages. And what we asked respondents to do was to just look at one of these messages only. So they were only presented with one of these, and they were asked to judge how accurate they thought this particular message was. So this was in isolation without the comparison to the other messages. So message 2A is Aussie workers can't make ends meet when migrant workers are working for as little as $1 an hour. So very much a migrant blaming message. The boss blaming message, Aussie workers can't make ends meet when dodgy bosses are paying migrants as little as $1 an hour. And then we had our third message of workers, whether Aussie born or newly arrived can't make ends meet when dodgy bosses are paying us as little as $1 an hour. As you can see, the statements 2B and 2C using the dodgy bosses framing, so to speak, were judged to be more accurate than the migrant blaming message of 2A. Also too, when you look at the migrant blaming message, the accuracy levels are about 10% lower than the other 2 messages. So you really are potentially costing a union 10% of your potential supporters, and also many other areas as well. We then asked people to give us a preference. So we presented them with the 3 messages all at once they looked at the accuracy of the message they were presented with. We asked them to choose the one that they preferred. As you can see, the statement 2C, which was workers, whether Aussie born or newly arrived, can't make ends meet when dodgy bosses are paying us as little as $1 an hour, was the preferred statement overall. Was also the preferred statement across the majority of our demographic segments as well. So very much broad would support. It was also the most preferred amongst those that were tolerant and very tolerant, and also those that were progressive and very progressive. Statement 2B, that had 39% preference. This was slightly preferred by Pauline Hanson voters, those in WA, 18 to 29-year-olds, permanent residents, speakers of languages other than English at home, more recent migration, and those that were very conservative or intolerant or very intolerant.
Yeah, so look, just to sum up, we really see very well in that data, the results of the work we did with Simone. We couldn't have been happier to see those results, and it really was a very clear endorsement, both of abandoning victim-blaming rhetoric in favour of boss-blaming messages, but more broadly of race-class constructions and the idea underpinning that of solidarity in contradiction to scarcity. So to maximise the appeal of union messages, we should definitely be utilising this race-class message design, and eliminating victim-blaming constructions may actually be an effective tool in inoculating folks against some of that right-wing populism that we have seen cropping up. Particularly you saw in that last slide, the right kind of hate that language around solidarity. Workers, whether newly arrived or local, can't make ends meet when bosses are paying us as little as. We love to see that the UAP hates that message, because what that means is that is in direct contradiction to the language that they are using on people, and that's going to have. And I mean, you saw in the effect of people genuinely find that language more compelling, more interesting, and more accurate. So that's what we love to see. And we're really glad to be able to now be rolling out this work around the country. We actually have a resource that we'll be able to distribute hopefully very shortly. It's waiting on a foreword at the moment, but that's pretty much it. Very, very shortly, and that's going to really assist you if you want to utilise this race class message design for your own campaign.